Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's much-awaited session. I'm Neha Sharma, your host today evening, and I lead the social impact and professional services practice at Executive Access. A lot has evolved in the social impact and development ecosystem in India and globally also in the last decade. However, a lot has changed as well in the last 60 to 90 days, giving us all an ever new set of challenges. It's great to have amongst us a very accomplished set of panelists who are at the forefront of these issues. We're eager to get their insights and learnings on how they're looking at responding and relooking at varied facets of this sector going forward and from here on. Without taking much more time, I'd like to quickly introduce you to them. First, we have Gaurav Gupta. Gaurav is currently the partner and regional director Asia for Dalberg Advisors. He founded and set up their Asia practice based out of Mumbai and also leads their global energy practice. Gaurav has worked on wide-ranging issues, including energy access, financial inclusion, inclusive business strategies, M&E frameworks for large international foundations and corporates. Previously, he worked with BCG at their London and Sydney offices, alumni of Yale and Oxford University. He's a Fairfax scholar. Gaurav is also an occasional investor, including 2 eco-resorts and an eco-friendly fashion label as well, amongst others. Welcome to the panel, Gaurav. Next, we have Seema Bansal. Seema is partner and director at BCG, where she leads their social impact practice and is also leading member of the public sector practice for the firm based in Delhi. She's been with the firm for over 20 years and has worked extensively in diverse sectors like financial services, telecommunications, apart from social impact in areas of strategy, operational excellence, culture, and organization design. In the social ecosystem, she's worked extensively in areas of food security, skilling and employment, health and nutrition, agriculture, education, governance reforms, amongst others. Alumni of IIM Calcutta, Seema has delivered inspiring TED Talks as an author for Center for Public Impact at BCG and also leads their foundation. Welcome to the panel, Seema. Next, we have Rishi Agarwal. Rishi is currently Managing Director and Head Asia at FST. He also heads the global wash practice for the firm. He works on a wide range of issues, including wash, health, clean energy, livelihoods, and circular economy. Previously, Rishi has worked in organizations like the Monitor Group, Russell Reynolds, and Unilevers across regions, including Africa, Asia, and US in strategy, operations, search, and commercial functions. Alumni of IIM and Oxford University, Rishi is presently included in multiple wash initiatives in multiple countries, co-leading the growing livelihood opportunities for women initiative at FST as well. Welcome to the panel, Rishi.
Thanks, Neha.
Next, we have Arpita. Arpita is CEO at M-CRIL, an organization that pioneered microfinance ratings globally. She has over 25 years experience in management and risk consulting roles. Previously, she was partner and sector head telecom at PwC and has worked with organizations like KPMG, Arthur Andersen, and ICICI Advisory in leadership roles. She's led projects in 30 plus countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East, Japan, Europe, and US. Alumni of IIM Ahmedabad and Delhi College of Engineering, Arpita is passionate about governance practices at board level, also enjoys mentoring innovative tech-led young entrepreneurs reach scale. Welcome to the panel, Arpita. Finally, we have Gaurav Goel. Gaurav is the founder and CEO of Samagra Governance, a mission-driven consulting firm, which he founded in 2012. Gaurav previously worked with McKinsey and Company as a management consultant, where he worked across sectors and geographies, solving diverse corporate problem statements. Samagra is currently driving 9 statewide transformations across diverse domains, also works closely with Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship and Niti Aayog at the center. Alumni of IIM Calcutta and IIT Delhi, Gaurav's path-breaking efforts to tackle strong governance challenges led him to be recognized in Business World's 40 under 40 list of change makers in 2019. Welcome to the panel, Gaurav. Our moderator for the session today is Swati Vasudevan. Till recently, Swati was the CEO at Indian School of Public Policy, before which she also worked with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, heading their strategy planning, operations, HR, and finance functions. She has over 24 years of experience in diverse sectors in strategy, P&L, and general management roles across countries in Southeast Asia, Far East, and the US. Starting as a service engineer in oil and gas rig, she later worked with McKinsey and Cisco Foods in US and Schneider Electric and Safe Water Network in India. Alumni of Chicago Booth School of Business and IIT Delhi, she is currently consulting a string of startups, helping them in their journey. Welcome, Swati. I'm privileged to know all of you and a bit about your journeys, and we'll dive a little bit for the audience convenience in that space also towards the later part of the session. Over to you, Swati.
Thank you, Neha. Delighted to be here to join this
amazing panel that you got lined up today. It's going to be an interesting discussion. So let's get started. With or without COVID, development space has been evolving, with each sector within it changing, adjusting, responding, or reacting to a change, and in some cases even disrupting things, but at varying pace. They say never let a good crisis go waste. In addition to the immediate blows, of course, crises also help bring about disruption, and they shed light on issues that existed but were not acknowledged adequately, or issues we didn't know existed at the level that they do. During such crises, new problems are created, for example, labor migration. Readiness levels become transparent, and not just at a macro country level, but also at a micro level, such as household resilience. New solutions to old problems grow shoots, for example, use of technology or television to increase access to education. Systemic gaps come to light, for example, digital inequality impacting access to learning. Baselines get thrown out the window, for example, those relating to keeping the girls in school longer. Funding gets diverted, behavior changes take place, both negative and positive. For example, heightened sense of hygiene amongst our citizens. Talent shifts take place, for example, by driving more people towards development work. All of these panelists today cover a gamut of sectors in the development space. I really welcome the opportunity to hear your perspectives on changes experienced within a given sector or across sectors, so feel free to pick. Let's start with a focus on short-term to medium-term as our lens for change. I'd like to start with Rishi. Rishi, I'd like to hear from you about the washed sector specifically. What changes have you seen the sector experiencing in the last few months?
Thanks, Swati. I just want to make sure that the audience can actually hear us, because on the chat box and on the Q&A, I've been seeing comments about they can't hear us. So if we can confirm that they can actually hear us. Oh, awesome. So we got a comment back saying they can hear us now. Great. So Swati, thanks for the question. I think in terms of WASH, which in some sense is three different sectors, which is water access, sanitation, and hygiene, the impact has been varied, right? So varied by sector, varied by the customer type we are talking about. As far as water access goes, individuals on this webinar have had no impact, but people, a large proportion of people in urban India who are buying water has had a significant impact. They didn't have access to potable water. They weren't able to get water even if they wanted to buy, and wherever it was available to purchase, it was twice, thrice as expensive as it normally was. So there has been a significant challenge that the virus has thrown up and shown the which our delivery systems have, and then are geared towards the more rich in some ways. On sanitation, it's always been a push product. I think with the governments and households shifting expenditure away from what would be discretionary products to basic necessities, I do see spend on sanitation coming down both in the government and the household space. I think hygiene is an interesting space, especially if you start considering menstrual hygiene. As I said, if you look at the consumer and household expenditure, it's going to severely be depressed because of just low incomes. And that means a lot of adolescent girls going into puberty now are going to look at their menstrual behavior, the habit forming years. They might not have access to sanitation pads. And that's going to be a significant challenge that we need to sort of start thinking about and addressing now. And as you said, never waste a good crisis, but let's not focus only on the crises. Let's also look at what the long-term goals are and how can we actually make sure that we don't lose sight of those as we're working on the immediate challenges.
Thanks for sharing that, Rishi. So it sounds like many of these sectors do undergo some changes which during these times which do set the tone for how things could be in the future. And I think, and let's come to that and dive a little deeper to understand and unpack that a little bit. But let me shift a little bit to Gaurav Goel. And Gaurav, I'd love to hear from the lens of a different sector, but your teams have been doing some very interesting work in the government schemes and services delivery area, education, agriculture. So talk to us about what disruptions you're seeing in the field And more importantly, what kind of skill sets you're seeing in short supply to deal with these changes?
I think, thanks, Swati. Since most 100% of our work is with governments, one of the things that has really stood out over the last couple of months across domains and across governments, and when I mean across government means across states, in terms of the ability to deal with the crisis has been the following. So wherever there have been systemic enablers that existed from before, in which the government has invested over the years, and this is through long-term reforms, these are through long-term transformations and so on, the ability of the government to respond to the crisis has been very, very good. And wherever these systemic enablers have not existed, the governments have kind of struggled. Let me just explain by two examples in the domains that you mentioned just now. So for instance, the government of Haryana over the last 2-3 years invested in building this government to citizen platform called Untitled, which provides all G2C 550 odd schemes and services cutting across 36 government ministries and departments to the citizens in a seamless manner. And also the back-end processing of after the application is done is also taken care of. Now, when the COVID lockdown happened and the governments had to issue, let's say, e-passes to the citizens for movement or passes to industry to operate. Now, it could be overnight, these workflows could be overnight built on the platform and be enabled for the citizens. So if you look at just the e-passes, in a short period of time, Haryana built the e-pass system on the Saral platform and could deliver some 7 lakh plus passes over a span of a couple of weeks, and which is a lot for a small state like Haryana. Now, the reason that could happen because such a platform existed. And a lot of us on the panel itself, some of us are from Gurgaon, and I can say with confidence that with the ease with which these passes were delivered in Gurgaon versus, let's say, a Delhi would be significantly different. And it's nothing to do with the intent of the government. It's purely to do by the fact that has investment been made in systemic enablers. Right? Let me pick another example from a different state, Odisha. The government of Odisha a couple of years back launched this the program called Kalia, where the idea was to give direct cash transfers to citizens, to farmers, to landless farmers and landholding farmers into their bank accounts as an income augmentation scheme. Now, in the process of doing that, it kind of did a huge bunch of massive operations across the entire state, a lot of algorithms, a lot of data matching at the back end to make sure that a database existed and the bank accounts of the farmers were there where the money can be sent. Now, in such a crisis, when you want to do DBT to your citizens, and it's a largely agricultural state, such a system comes in handy. On a click of a button, the government kind of can make money available in the bank accounts of the people. And the same at a national level holds, for example, for Jan Dhan accounts. Because there was so much effort made over the years in the Jan Dhan account, it becomes an enabler in this time. So this is one of the highlights that at least I've noticed across domains and across states, that if such things exist, if the governments over a period of time invest in these systems, and it's a lot of effort, it's laboriously done, then they come in handy at the time of crisis. And if not, then it's basically brute force at play.
That's a great example. Thanks for sharing, Gaurav. I mean, it sounds like both the examples that you gave highlight the importance of prioritizing systemic changes when working on a space, trying to do some problem solving, as opposed to maybe doing symptomatic band-aid work. But of course, one is more longer term in nature in terms of how long it takes to make an impact versus short-term band-aids obviously are, don't take that as long. So I'm sure there's a balance somewhere. So let me kind of be a little provocative and hand it over to Seema. Seema, I know you do a lot of work in education sector, public health, and what do you think of what Gaurav just said? And do you agree with that approach of systemic changes? And if not, if you have examples that you can illustrate to provide evidence of the contrary, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, Swati, I think on this one, I think what Gaurav has said is honestly exactly right? And let me just highlight examples of places where we haven't seen those systemic capabilities actually get built. And let's do that at a sectoral level, right? So employment generation has been something that, India has been talking about for a long time. The fact that we need to create more jobs, we need to create more entrepreneurial opportunities. It's been a huge topic, very big agenda for both, central government, state governments, etc. And potentially COVID has taken us many miles backwards on that one, right? Just the number of people who have lost jobs in the short term, and possibly the number of people who would have, who may never, who may struggle to get jobs in the long term as well, because it's yet to be seen when the economy opens up, what does it look like and what jobs will actually come back. One of the things that we've been working on over the last 1 year was, the idea of digital platforms for employability at the bottom of the pyramid, and why those don't actually exist. And for example, one of the thesis was that there's a huge amount of, there's potentially a huge amount of demand for employment and gig type of employment at the bottom of the pyramid. Imagine the entire MSME sector, 6 lakh MSMEs in the country. And most of them are possibly inefficient because they don't have access to just-in-time talent or labor. 4 of my loaders have, fallen sick, or 3 of them have gone home for Diwali. And suddenly I'm lacking talent, I'm lacking labor. And where do I find it? And all of that was so informal, but imagine if a platform existed, for actually matching that demand and supply. And we've been having this conversation for almost a year with, foundations, with the government, etc. But yet, enough movement hadn't actually happened. And now with COVID, as the entire employer-employee relationship across the country has broken, right? Except for like white collar jobs, all blue collar jobs. And one is thinking about how does one put that ecosystem back together. I think such a platform is the need for it is suddenly felt even much more so, right? I mean, different parts of the country are going to open up at different points of time. Different parts of the economy, different sectors are going to open up at different parts of time. As a blue collar worker, how do I figure out where do I go? Where do I find a job? This is also a time when public transportation is very difficult. I also don't want to move around. So imagine, for example, if a digital infrastructure for employment, bottom of the pyramid existed, what it could have led to, right? And I'm going to pause there, but the same holds true for public health, another sector which has gone through a huge amount of crisis while there's capacity getting created around COVID response, but everyone else, who needed healthcare, they are not being catered to because facilities are just shut. In rural India, PHCs are shut, district hospitals are shut, or they're providing a different set of services. Again, imagine if we had digital infrastructure for some level of healthcare, for push-based medicine, for telemedicine, what could have that looked like? So I do think that many parts of the development sector have gotten a significant jolt about, having operated in such sort of brick and mortar, non-digital ways over the last so many years. And I do think that in the medium and long term, we will see this crisis do a lot of good in terms of the development sector, government, NGOs, foundations, everyone else thinking much more breakthrough about the problems that we're facing, today and tomorrow.
That's interesting. So it sounds like accessibility is, a heightened problem given the current scenario, and the current crisis is also, in some ways, accelerated the need for systemic changes and kind of given it a little bit more political salience than it otherwise would have gotten. So I'd love to hear from, in this case, let's say Arpita. Where do you see a similar type of a situation in the area of financial inclusion? And I know that in your case, at a macro level, the credit flow has kind of come to a halt. So how do you see that affecting or shaping the financial services for the poor right now? And what, when the proverbial dust settles down after COVID situation gets over, where do you see the entities in the ecosystem landing?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Swati. Just to set the background here, we work extensively with institutions which work with financially excluded people, which means people who don't have access to formal financial systems, banks, etc. So we work extensively with microfinance institutions across the region, and in India also with MFIs and small finance banks, and now increasingly with fintechs which are focused on the bottom of the pyramid, fintechs and MSMEs focused on the bottom of the pyramid. So you're right, Swati. The credit flow had suddenly stopped. Their income flows, so the segment that we are talking about, their income flows was majorly disrupted. I would say there are different parts of this piece if you look at it. I think eventually the central bank, if we focus our discussion only to India in this case, I think the regulator did step in, took some time, but did step in with measures. So initially they announced the moratorium. So that worked very well for the financially, for this segment, which is serviced by the microfinance institutions and the banks, the financially excluded people. And, but what the problem that the intermediaries are facing, the microfinance institutions are facing, is that the same moratorium has not got passed to them from their own sources. So that's a challenge that they are facing. I think going forward, everybody has to realize the lenders to these intermediate institutions, impact investors who also fund these institutions, that funds will be required to get them back on the feet. And why one is saying that? Because a lot of these are small traders, micro enterprises, they need the money to restart. So they need to recognize that they're going to lose their earlier money also if they don't fund incrementally, right? To get, so I think that bit of understanding has to seep through the system. So that's one change. I think the other one that I would definitely want to mention here is there has been talk by Gaurav and Seema about digital platforms. So financial inclusion is a classic case where digital is being used to actually to create impact at scale. Gaurav likes to say that, I know. So impact at scale at low transaction costs. So I think very important. And what we have seen is that that system has come through, but not at the scale that we would like to. And it has given a big jolt to the institutions. So the fintech companies, like I mentioned, they were already on a digital platform. So there was no worries there. And most of their interfaces with their end clients were digital. But the MFIs, they were still slow on their digital journey. And I think what COVID has made them realize is that they need to hasten their act. Because there was a time for 2 months, their collections dropped to nearly 20% of what their numbers were. And it was becoming very challenging. And some of them had, very few of them had assisted digital model, wherein an agent would go to a rural and remote area and collect. But that was also not possible in the lockdown. So I think I'll stop here, but I would just like to summarize by saying that COVID has actually shown a mirror to all of the players in the value chain. And each one has to now look at the scenario and alter their strategy going forward, because one doesn't know when COVID impact will go away. Especially in this sector, it will last, especially in this bottom of the pyramid sector for the people. They are going to face the brunt for the next 2-3 years, assuming nothing comes back. But I think everybody has to relook at their strategies.
Thanks for that perspective. And this is interesting because this is one of those sectors. Financial inclusion is one of those sectors where the market making has been at the forefront through the regulator enabling the market making to happen. And but just kind of stepping away for a second, it also makes me realize how some sectors are moving at such a much faster pace than the others. And in this scenario where pretty much every sector is going through disruptive changes, some non-disruptive, some disruptive, some negatively disruptive, some positive disruptive. But it's so easy to have these silos be formed. So before I go to Gaurav Gupta, who I have a lot of interesting questions for, but I just wanted to open it out to everyone to see if anyone has any insights to share on the following. Everybody is going through changes. Everyone is observing their sectors going through changes. Is anyone of you experiencing any efforts or initiating any efforts, or maybe is witness to any efforts of understanding what the others are going through, how they're dealing with it, and what lessons there could be to learn from that sector to apply into our sector? Is there anyone who has any such experiences that they would like to share? Maybe we'll come back to it. So I just want to plant the thought. We'll come back to it later. So let's switch to Gaurav, Gaurav Gupta. So Gaurav, I'd like to switch to you because you have an experience with a lot of different types of sectors, climate, energy, MLE, very different from what we've spoken about so far. So I'd love for you to tell us about what you're experiencing in terms of the challenges that your clients are facing and what types of questions your clients are asking. And more importantly, what types of questions should they be asking in the current times?
Thanks, Swati. I think it's a great question. And I think just as a bit of background for us, our business is working with any type of client. So we don't really think in sectoral ways, like we don't think of the development sector as such, but we essentially work with a client if the problem statement they bring to us is, can you help me optimize for social impact? And so hence our clients come in all flavors from governments and foundations, but actually interesting private sector to some pretty interesting individuals as well. So it's really the problem statement that defines what we look at. And it has been, of course, a really tumultuous time. One thing I would say just from a macro sense, right? Just it's worth noting that what has actually happened over the last few months is that people who are in the business of helping others in this crisis have dived in, because a crisis, there's no look before you leap, you dive in and you start helping, right? And at the same time, the majority of them have had their budgets cut. We're in a very strange situation right now. Civil society is at the forefront of a lot of things that are happening right now to try and make our systems work, to be there on the front lines, to even identify and help some of the government schemes that we've been hearing about to make them actually function. Those civil society organizations, those NGOs who are out there trying to make that system work and are working much harder than ever, are also at the same time experiencing a real problem with fundraising, right? CSR money has gone down, a lot of money has shifted to the government. Traditional methods have come down in terms of fundraising just because we're in an economic crisis. So that's the macro picture, that you're in a very strange situation, that the people who are one of the frontline workers are actually also at the same time working harder and having less resources. So that's actually one of the underpinnings of a lot of the work that people are describing. It's happening in all of the sectors that we've just been speaking about. I think in terms of what are the challenges clients are bringing to us here, of course, I think there's what you would expect to see, which is there's some clear pivots. There's the short term versus the long term. And that's generally a business model question, but there's also a lot of fundraising. And the kind of things that end up happening is your baselines have changed, right? Now, if you think about a lot of work in the social space, it's about saying, this was what my problem looked like, and now this is what I will improve about it. Now, I'll give one example. So let's say you're in the business of really helping deal with some of the really terrible gender divides, getting girls back into school, better educational outcomes. Now, in every crisis that has happened, especially financial crisis, girls get pulled back out of school. You can go back to all of the statistics in India, girls get pulled back out of school. So if you've been working on generational changes and trying to get girls into school, and suddenly you face this enormous crisis, your baselines everything has shifted. And the question is, can you make it such that this is just a very quick short-term impact and it doesn't affect you long-term? Or can you do something very dynamic and pivot so that you don't lose decades of gains, right, that have happened? So those are the kind of very real challenges. I think just to also give you a sense of the enormity, maybe I'll pick something. So let's pick gender. Gender is very interesting because it's very cross-cutting. All the things that everyone else has talked about, 50% of that is what's happening to women in that sector, right? The thing that's coming out is that everything has a digital divide. Everything has an increased care burden. So if you're dealing with education, everyone's very excited about tech. And there's the potential that this could bring forward a lot of digital technologies into education, which everyone has been dreaming about. But the digital access for women is even worse than people thought. As you start to look at some of the data, girls on mobile phones is a no-no in many societies and in villages. Like it's a really difficult thing to get access to. And so we have this huge sort of digital divide on the gender front. If you look at unpaid care, big gender issue, right? In India, if you look at the level of unpaid care that takes place, it's about 10x. Women do about 10x to men. Now that's a lot. It's one of the worst. But you should also recognize in some of the most developed and advanced economies, it's still a multiple, right? So this is not completely unique to India. That was the usual situation. What's happened during the lockdown? Several hundred million, I think 320 million children are in homes, right? They're not in educational institutions. But 100 million elderly people need care. 50 million people who work in house help are no longer there, right? You can imagine the enormity of the care burden that has suddenly taken place. So our estimates show about 30% increase in the care burden that women are facing, even when there's, in normal times, it's already 10x. So these are some of these big system shocks that are affecting sort of almost everything, every type of sector. So gender, I think, is a really interesting one, and to put that gender lens on. I think there is good news, because the big problem with unpaid care is that it was invisible. And I think there is the potential to come out of this and make that much more visible. It is sort of 40 to 60% of our GDP. So I think there are some potential. Lots of people are very worried about migrant labor coming back into villages, and the fact that there's MREGA work which women have actually taken on, and that all disappearing for women. But there's also a positive potential there. You have young men returning from villages. How does that actually become a force for good around attitudinal change, rather than us thinking that is necessarily a negative outcome? So I think gender is an example of the kind of system shocks that are going on, and that's what our clients are really asking of us to say, how do I deal with such a dynamic system? What are the big pivots that we need to make? And the important thing is, in some of those cases, big pivots are needed. In others, it's actually to say, hey, how do you stay the course? What you were dealing with was important before, it's important now, it'll continue to be important, and actually don't take your eye off the ball. So there isn't a single answer to that. So I think that's some of the things we're grappling with.
So that's an interesting point, because what you just highlighted here was also a balance when you're doing strategy advisory for a client that's doing impact work, the balance between short-term and long-term, because there are shifts that are happening now, and they're enough to get you to take the eyes off the ball. So as to say, in some cases, maybe it makes sense to take the eyes off the ball and fix the problem right now, because some of these issues that happen today, as Rishi was mentioning, some of these are habit forming, and the habits that form today will become habits for the long term, and they'll be harder to break. So maybe so there is some sense in focusing on that short-term fixes right now and here. At the same time, you also don't want to lose some of the gains you've made, and you want to stay on the trajectory, even though it's a little different trajectory now and a different growth rate, but you kind of want to stay on that trajectory for the long term as well, which is a great segue into talking, kind of moving the discussion of how the sector is changing and how we cope with it to long-term lens. We've talked about the short-term to medium-term so far, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit towards long-term. Let me stay on you, Gaurav, because you kind of give a really nice overview of what's happening on the gender side and some shifts that are taking place there, and also on how the baseline being disrupted is causing some shifting in the mindset of how people are looking at development sector work, and whether they should continue, whether they should not, especially given the funding is changing. So let me stay with you and ask you a follow-up question. Which of these changes do you foresee will be permanent shifts, whether it's on gender, whether it's on any of the other sectors that you talked about? And more importantly, what do you think the sector needs to do to evolve itself or reinvent itself to prepare for this long-term, now what becomes a trend?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Look, I think that, and this is, I suspect is true for everything. The only thing you should really track for the long term is really behavior. Behavior drives everything else in a sense. So especially in our world where you're trying to design things that are essentially have a social outcome. And I think earlier, Seema, Rishi, Gaurav actually all sort of, and Arpita all talked about digital, right? So that's a behavior shift. Although, one thing I would note about digital, because the question is, where does it land? You're seeing a shift today, And what you're seeing is something that's very up and down. Question is, where will something like that land? And even the simplest example of Jan Dhan accounts and cash transfers, you know, we just did a 50,000 household survey to try and understand how government schemes are working. And it's pretty impressive. You know, I think they swung into action, but they were also quite overwhelmed. The system that worked the best was PDS. If you tracked how quickly the additional amounts of grains were getting out to people, the free grains were getting to people, reliability of the system, that was the fastest and the most widespread. As opposed to a system which was completely digital, right? And you just transfer cash. You would imagine that's speedy and it's accurate and so on. But remember, a lot of the ways people track this stuff is through government data as opposed to user data, right? The challenges that users face are quite different. The roles that the government have are different from what a user is saying, hey, I'm below the poverty line, I'm a woman, where's this money, or that has not come through. Or even when money has come through, actually accessing the cash was incredibly difficult. For close to 50% of people did not withdraw cash because it was so difficult to get. So there's, you know, we saw again and again, and we're seeing this now in the education space as well, that idea of bringing digital alongside a physical sort of capability. And so the way this lands is not this incredible revolution from where you are today to something completely digital, but there's something about, it is an evolution. And that's certainly what we're seeing in many things. So I think that's one thing in terms of long-term, there'll be a huge behavior shift. It's already happened on the digital, and we should follow that. And as other speakers have said, that's going to be overall remarkably positive, but we shouldn't over-index on the digital side. What we should index on is that people are behaving differently and follow the behavior. And some of that incorporates digital rather than putting a digital lens on it. And I think sometimes that leads us a little bit astray. I think the other thing that, I don't know if this is, it depends what you call the long term, but one thing we're advising clients is, yes, it feels like the fiscal space is shrinking. Of course it is, right? What another way to think about it is that money is shifting. If you think about the huge amount of loans and expenditure that have been announced by the government, right? In the best of times, government is not even able to spend what it usually spends in the best of times. You have all of these different budgets that are sitting there unspent, and the majority of the reason is that they don't actually have the full capacity to execute on it. Now you've announced all of these like big spending, the need to do lots of different things, get the economy restarted, there'll be lots of infrastructure spending, there's lots of social spending. The question is, who is going to execute on that? And for me, that is the opportunity for a lot of people who are very interested in social impact. They have to begin to align themselves with the better delivery of government services. Right? And there are people here on this panel who are very well attuned to doing that. You can speak a lot more. But from speaking from a trends perspective, right? It's also about shift towards who now has the money. It's not about CSR. It's not only about what private sector wants to do. It's actually, and one of the challenges for civil society is, you know, part of the role is to hold government accountable. So that's going to be a challenge. But I think that's one long-term trend I also see, is that can you shift towards being someone that helps execute on this massive agenda that we as a country need to be undertaking, because we have very low execution capacity.
Let's pick that thought and use Gaurav Goel's experience in unpacking that a little bit. So I heard three things from Gaurav Gupta. He talked about a hybrid kind of a model. So not just a physical and not just an entirely digital. Let's not try and go from one completely to the other overnight, but kind of maybe go gradually towards a hybrid model and then to digital over God knows when, you know, how many decades it might take. That's one thing I heard. I also heard you talk about the importance of digital. And I heard, Gaurav, you talk earlier about the systemic changes, digital being a large part of that systemic change. Then third thing I heard you talk about was government's initiatives to kind of catapult a lot of this effort towards maximizing impact and scaling for impact, to use a previous phrase that Arpita used. So Gaurav, Gaurav Goel, let me come to you. You have, again, from your experience of working with the government and also on the skilling area, etc. Talk to us about how the government, you think, is adapting to living with Corona and also gearing up for life post-Corona. And how does it where does the whole concept of digitization and capitalizing on this shift fit in all of that?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to governments, I think this is the best time. If there's one kind of reform that would have the maximum spillover effect across sectors, across domains, it is actually governance reforms, right? If we can get our act together, the way our governance mechanisms are set up, then it's going to bound to kind of have a lot of spillover. I feel this is the time to really implement maximum governance, minimum government. Right? There's no better time to do that than now. And while there's a lot of appetite that you see both in the government of India as well as the states kind of do that, but it's not easy, right? Some of the things are more stroke of the pen decisions, which are more likely to happen. And some of them, as I was saying, are more laborious things that there are habits that need to be built over time, systems that need to be set up, initiatives that need to be rolled out over years. Right, so it's not as easy. But if there's any time when there is more need to kind of do that or more realization to do that, it's basically now. The whole COVID crisis has kind of highlighted both the strengths of our governance system as well as a lot of its weaknesses. And if I will just indulge with me, I'll just quickly kind of summarize some of the key things that have kind of stood out. If you talk about the strengths, right, the ability of a system to firefight, that's one of the strengths, right? Because you ask any young IAS officer in any of the district, and very little time gets spent on constructive things. So, and I'm not going to example, but that's the strength of the system. It comes in handy in these kind of times. Then the ability to enforce or drive compliance is another strength of the system. Right, so when you have lockdown 1, lockdown 2, which is the most stringent anywhere in the world and done on a short notice, then also a country as diverse and as large as us, we're able to kind of implement that lockdown because there's clarity of communication. Nearly everything is shut down, and the system can enforce that. So that's another strength one can say of the system, which has come in kind of handy during these times. But at the same time, there are a lot of weaknesses also. Another strength you can say is the ability to kind of respond to a crisis, because the approach that comes in a crisis is all hands on deck. And a lot of the other distractions, a lot of the other inaction, the tendency of lethargy or the tendency even for corruption, all of this kind of takes a side seat, and everyone is kind of on the job. So we respond well to crisis in that sense. But there are a lot of limitations that have come to light, and that's important to understand. One is the inability to deal with complexity. Right. Whenever you have a complex problem statement, how do you improve health indicators in the country? How do you improve learning outcomes in the country? These are complex problem statements that are not going to happen through one intervention or stroke of the pen. Right. There, the system kind of suffers. The usual response to that is comprehensiveness without coherence. So you do 100 things, not talking to each other, at variance with each other, and so on. Or you just brute force. You put more hands on the job and feel something would happen. So that's one limitation. Another key limitation is actually around medium-term planning. So we are very good at longer-term things, because in long term you have to talk about the what. In the medium term you have to talk about the how. Right. So Atmanirbhar Bharat is a good long-term strategy, because it says that we have to be self-reliant, and it's a policy framework of sorts. So it's a construct of sorts which can help you. But then what needs to happen this year? What needs to happen next year for us to become self-reliant in 10 years? That's the real challenge, or that's the real limitation at a macro level of the system. Right? And the third one is I would say more related to its strength when I say that the ability to drive compliance, which also means that everyone is looking for somebody from an order from the top. Right. So a lot of things which are under our control as a state government or as a district and so on, we are often looking for somebody to tell us that we need to act. And that's only gotten more this thing over the last couple of decades, with more centralization of power, both in the state as well as in the center. So these are things which have always been there. There's nothing new in this, except that it has come to light. It's become more vivid. It's become more explicit during these times. And if we can act on this, if we can really act on governance reforms, if we can really this appetite for that, but it's not easy. Some of the things are easy, some will take a lot of work. Now, coming to sectors, this will take 30 more seconds. Let's say education, for instance, right? If the living with corona phase is what you're talking about, I think if you've not been able to get our students to learn, or we've not been able to improve learning outcomes of our students over 60 years, there's no way we're going to do it in the next 6 months in the living with corona phase. We can try 100 things that we are doing, and I think because a lot of organizations in the impact domain also happen to be in education, there's a lot of frantic activity, right? And all that is valid. Everyone has to try. All of us have to try. But the reality is that we're not going to kind of teach our students in these 6 months. What we can try to do is minimize the damage, minimize the losses, and so on. But if we can, the silver lining is if we can learn the right lessons. And the lessons are that we need to provide digital access till the to the last kind of student in the country. We need to engage our parents in the learning process. We need to find a way to kind of engage with our teachers also more effectively. If we can take some of these right lessons, and some of them have to do with the digital this thing, then I think we stand a chance if we kind of implement them and do something around them in the longer run, which is the post-corona phase. And same with other things, even scheme service delivery, right? I take the example of Haryana. A lot has been achieved in terms of doing it in a seamless manner, in a time-bound manner, convenience to the citizen. But this is the time to really think the next step. Can we make it contactless? Can we make it paperless? Right? Why do we need so many documents to be submitted? Why do we? Why is a 5-step approval process there when we can do in one? So all of these are things which are good thing are on the table now. These discussions are there. This openness to kind of look into these things and act on these things. But again, all of it would depend on how these things play out in the post-corona phase, where the living with corona has made them more relevant suddenly. And I completely agree with Gaurav, right? So we cannot put blinkers on and say digital is the answer to everything. I think digital is an enabler. The problem statement is what is important and what are the responses. And some of the responses may have a digital strategy alongside it. That's the way to look at it.
I'd love to hear Seema's thoughts on a lot of what you said from perspectives of both education and labor migration issue, which has recently come to limelight during this crisis. And Seema, you talked a little bit about it earlier, and you also spoke about how there have been ripple effects of the migrant labor crisis on other sectors, the MSME and employment sector, etc., and their resilience. What I'd love to hear is, how because it's a new issue that has been highlighted. Nobody knows where this is going to land. I'd love to hear from you in the long term. What are some of the things that are either being looked at or maybe need to be looked at to make sure there's no repeat of this kind of a crisis next time on the migrant labor issue? That's one. And I'm going to add another question to this. From the education standpoint, based on what Gaurav said. So he talked about some of the very important and kind of pertinent things about the learnings coming out, the engaging with bettering the pedagogy, or engaging with teachers, and the digitization and access to providing that access to digitization, etc. Do you have any exemplars you can share with us where some of these are being recognized and being worked on, and you're showing impact?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, firstly, just I think commenting on a little bit on what both Gaurav Gupta and Gaurav Goel said, right? I think and Gaurav Gupta said, where does digital land, right? And I think the only thing I'd like to say is that some of it is for us to shape, where digital lands, right? Because today everyone's kind of moved to digital, whether it be in education, so content is getting sent out, on WhatsApp, radio, TV, in every possible way. Like the whole education world has gone digital, and completely recognizing the digital divide, right? At the end, best case scenario, 15 to 20% government school kids are using it. Best case scenario, right? Maybe 30%, but that's what it is, because that's the cell phone, smartphone, data connectivity. But I would say that, what we need to do collectively in the development space, including governments, funders, etc., is say, where do we want it to land? right? What is now the 5-year vision for what is the role that digital can play, whether it's in education or health or something else? And then how do we help everyone stick to that plan even once, this COVID crisis is over and schools open? Because it is very likely that our government school systems, once schools start opening, will start going back to, we need to get the schools open, they need to be clean, they need to be sanitized, teachers need to be brought back to schools, and digital will just go out of the window, right? And this huge opportunity, and to what Gaurav Goel said, that we've learned about the possibilities of digital going forward, has the potential to actually just go out of the window if we don't stick with it. So I think we need to honestly hold on to that. So both as service providers, as funders, foundations, people who work in the field, to kind of use this time to also say, where do we want to land, and and how do we actually get there? So that's, I think, that onus is on us. And I think the same thing, not on the digital side, but also on the migrant labor employment side, is look, we had rampant sort of urbanization. We had how many millions of people sort of come to urban towns to do the jobs that they did, right? And at this point of time, being able to question that model a little bit, right? Is that the right answer for India? Do we need to think about better and more thriving rural economies? We did some work in agriculture last year, and what we said was that if you really wanted to actually have the small farmer thrive, then you need to actually put a whole bunch of services around the small farmer. Plant health, so for animal health, they have livestock, but do they have doctors, who can actually, or healthcare workers for animals who can take care of it, processing, storage. And if you do all of that, not only will farmer incomes double, but you will also create another ecosystem of jobs who are providing all of this to the farmer. And as that happens, you will create a stronger economy, and that will have secondary, tertiary effects on, spending powers, etc. So is this potentially the right time to think about some of those things, as we think about labor and employment, and do we want to go back to where we were? Do we want to have so much urbanization and so much of the economy just centered around a few urban centers, or do we want, some of that to actually just move back, right? Mm-hmm. So I think those are the kinds of things one needs to think about. And Swati, to your last question, just in terms of, education, completely agree with Gaurav. I think, we're seeing this, right? We're seeing that, digital in itself has, reaches to a certain point, right? But when you bring the entire ecosystem together, what is the potential that it creates is amazing. So, one of the states that we work in is Madhya Pradesh, and, they launched a campaign where they said that while we're sending out the digital content, every teacher has to engage with 5 or 10 students every day and just call them up and sort of say, hey, did you see the content? Did you like it? What did you learn? Whatever it is. And what we see is with that, the graph for MP is just moving off the charts vis-a-vis, let's say, many other states where that is actually not happening. So the idea of the physical and the digital, the social, the personal and the digital coming together, that's a very powerful one, right? We've seen, where like the government has just launched an app and said, download the app and do whatever you want with it. The usage is 1%, 1% of the others who are actually, consuming digital in another format. So I think that thinking through about digital at the end of the day is an enabler. It's not an end to itself, right? But I also, I think, someone just said that, this whole COVID situation has taken digital, which was always a footnote on any development strategy, and brought it a little bit more onto the main page and onto the center. I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah. So, thanks for saying that. And I want to make sure that we also don't, the entire conversation doesn't get sidetracked by digital alone, because there's so much more to the equation than just digitization. And Corona has, this COVID times has not only brought up the need for digitization, but I think there are a lot of other enablements that are needed, including market making by the government, or enablement by the government in terms of a more amenable regulatory environment and policy environment. Which brings me to a question for Rishi. Rishi, you spoke a little bit about WASH earlier, the sanitation space, and we just spoke about the need for government to play a multiplier effect role when we have this opportunity, especially right now when we have this opportunity, like Seema said, to change the narrative, to shape that narrative the way we want it to be. So given that, what what do you think would be the ideal role for the government to capitalize on this current shift that is happening, especially the positive shifts that are happening on the sanitation and the heightened sense of hygiene amongst the citizens, especially the poor?
Yeah, thanks, Swati. I think, I mean, personally, I don't work with governments as much, but looking at what governments are doing, I would say they've done an average job, right? I mean, if you look at the biggest challenge a crisis such as this throws up, it's a household resilience. Economies at a macro level will take at least 2 to 3 years to recover. A poor household which has gone through an economic shock will take 10 years to 2 generations to recover, depending on how deep they went in, right? So looking at that, what the government has done has been, in some ways, abdicated the responsibility to the private sector and said, thou shalt pay, right? You shall not cut salaries, you shall not fire people. And 50% of the jobs are with MSMEs who don't have that kind of holding power. So what has happened is they've just shut shop and said, you know what, can't pay. You want to imprison me, imprison me. And that's where I think the government needs to move away from a regulator to an enabler role. We were talking about this earlier. I think Gaurav talked about it as well. The government is very good at regulating, and what it realizes is that it fails to shift gears when it's needed to. And this crisis has been a great mirror to the government. Government has been clamping down on NGOs, trying to regulate, and in some cases over-regulate NGOs and civil society in this country for the last few years. And the government has needed the civil society right now. Guess what? Without the NGOs and the civil society being the frontline workers and providing that multiplier effect, there was no way our response would have been half as good as what it was, right? Or even 1/4 as good. So for me, the government needs to sort of play the role of an enabler, play the role of creating the right infrastructure, whether it is the health infrastructure, whether it's, as Seema was talking about in agriculture, you start thinking about what are the associated services rather than just saying, oh, we'll do land reform. It's an easy thing to do, right? I mean, I will sign a bill, get it through the 2 houses and voila, done. But does it really create impact on the long term? I mean, land reforms happened post-independence. We have to see what happened. The other thing is find the right champions because, let's face it, most inclusive markets that have been built across the world, not just in India, have come out of civil movements, right? And civil movements have come out of crisis. So Amul came out of the independence movement. Amul came out of Gujarat, Sardar Patel, sort of encouraging the milk farmers in Gujarat revolting against the Bombay Milk Society, putting milk on the road rather than selling it at reduced prices through a broker. Kenya tea, inclusion happened because of the independence movement. Financial inclusion in US happened because of civil rights movement, which we are seeing a recast of again. And guess what? These gains are not permanent. These gains will go back. So system is very good at doing one thing. It's very good at maintaining inertia, right? It is such a large mass that is traveling at a velocity in a certain direction that inertia is very difficult to move. And the toughest job I think everybody on this panel and most of the audience does is try to move the system. So in my sense, one of the biggest opportunity this crisis offers is it's dislodge the system. It's dislodge the system from status quo. So the opportunity the government has, all of us have, is to build it better, make sure that it lands at a better place and inertia doesn't push the rubber back and it goes back into its old status quo situation where we again start fighting about whether we should be doing digital platforms, whether we should be doing associated services, gender divide is, all of those situations coming in. I think government has to learn to let go and trust its own citizens and its own organizations to sort of say they would do the right thing for the country.
Yeah, no, point well made. And I think you're absolutely right that the government does need to play an enabler role. And I would, in fact, add to that, they also need to play a regulator role, totally depending on which sector we're talking about, because some sectors need more of one versus another, which brings me to Arpita. And I'll add a couple more things because as an enabler also, there's so many different types of roles the government can play. Like Gaurav Gupta had said earlier, and I know Seema, you alluded to as well, there's a whole aspect of behavior change. And there's a whole direct-to-consumer type of an approach that the government has been known to take in cases of public health, for example, and a lot of other sectors where those behavior change nudges can be impactful in moving the sector from point A to point B. Another example of such enablement could be market making, which is a classic example for which would be, again, financial services space. So coming to Arpita, and my last question for this section for you. So if you could just give us some examples of where the regulator or the government, whoever makes sense as you respond to the question, has played and can play a facilitator role, let me just use the word facilitator role, for capitalizing on the sectoral trends, whether they're secular trends or the current disrupted trends because of the current environment, either or.
Sure. So let me just start with, again, going back to the financial inclusion sector. So I think the government has done, and the regulator, I'm talking together, they've done a stellar job in putting the building blocks in place. So the India stack with the digital identity, with the payment interoperable payment system, with Aadhaar, etc. They have done a stellar job. We also extensively work with farmer produce organization and agri value chains, right? And in these circumstances, we are seeing the changes that they are going through. So they have done, in fact, the agricultural sector has done the best job in the COVID times. So as you have seen, none of us were short of vegetables or any other agricultural produce. They have done a stellar job in this COVID times. But when I see, even without the COVID, what they lack, and just for the benefit of the people who are listening to this webinar, farmer produce organization are actually companies, Section 8 company, not Section 8, a regular company under Companies Act, where every farmer is a shareholder in the company. That's a construct that the government is promoting. But that's a great construct. It takes away some of the negatives of the cooperatives that were initially envisaged, farmer cooperatives, because the farmers were really not getting the benefit. But the problem is that these farmer produce organizations lack access to credit. They lack access to talent. So some of the points that Seema was making earlier about, migration, these people who are going back, how do you hold them back, right? So you've got to have infrastructure to be able to attract talent who could run a farmer produce organization. You can't expect a farmer, and these are all farmer produce organization is a construct for essentially smallholder farmers, 1 to 2 to 3 acre of land, right? You can't expect a farmer to be able to manage an accounting book even for a farmer produce organization, right? So there's requirement for talent. They require working capital to buy inputs, to seeds, fertilizers, etc. They need talent to be able to talk to the big baskets or the Amazons of the world to be able to create the linkages to get better produce. So the government, of course, has to play one, like I said, in the financial inclusion space in India. They've done a stellar job. We are a best practice example for so many countries abroad. They're talking about how did you build the India stack. But in some places, the building block is there, but a prodding has to be done. And in this agriculture space, this is the right example. So, for example, when we work with the banks and the the public sector banks have the biggest presence in the rural areas in India. I was talking to a very senior official and he was telling me that what is the incentive for this person, loan officer who's sitting in one of my branches, to give loan for a wash loan, for example. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand how to evaluate a wash loan. Wash credit request. So that prodding has to be done. Similarly, we have all been talking about digital, but if you're talking about especially the excluded ones that whom we work with a lot through our MFI work, etc., there is a whole literacy and trust element, right? Somebody talked about, and the panel talked about women who are the even more excluded part of the whole segment. When there is one smartphone in the family, it's not the woman who has access to it, right? If she gets access, she doesn't know how to use it. So I think the prodding piece, hand-holding, encouraging institutions who could play this part would be very critical to move the needle, COVID or no COVID, I think.
Thank you. But again, well said. It's the prodding is needed. That whole nudging, as we talked about earlier, is absolutely needed. And you talked about talent. In fact, both you and Seema talked about talent, which is a perfect segue into our next section, which is a more conversation about talent from Neha. But before we do that, I'm going to subject each of you to a little bit of torture So I'm going to start with a rapid fire, and we'll start with you, Arpita, since you're on the mic and you have your mic unmuted. So I'm going to fire some questions at you. Try and answer them as quickly as you possibly can. Maybe 6 to 7 questions. Okay. So here comes the first one. What's your favorite house chore during COVID times?
Cooking.
Okay, that's a good one. Atmanirbhar, personally for you, what will that translate into?
For me, it's always been economic.
Mm-hmm. When the COVID times end, what's the first thing you will do?
I'll go for a long drive in the mountains. I really need it.
If you weren't on this session right now, where else would you have been?
Just hanging out, chilling, because there was a day full of webinar, Zoom calls. So just chilling. It's Friday evening.
Yeah. What do you dislike most about working from home?
I think the body language. I've been on these Zoom calls, internal client meetings, board meetings. I miss the body language. I like to meet people, and I think that nuance we can't get. So for all of us who are talking about digital, I think that's the one. There's no replacement.
And if you had a magic wand, what's that one thing you would do with it?
Post-COVID, which was better than the earlier. So all of us a lot more empathetic, a lot more mindful about how we live, how we take decisions. That I would want.
Okay, great. Thank you for bearing with me on that one. We shift to Gaurav Goel. Gaurav, you ready? Let's unmute your mic. Okay. So if you weren't a consultant, what else would you be?
I would be working with the government one way or the other, or in the government probably.
Interesting. A word that describes your skills as a kindergarten teacher. If you were a kindergarten teacher, what kind of kindergarten teacher would you have been?
I would keep my class in discipline.
What's your favorite part of your day?
I think at night, once I've done with and have time for myself basically to think.
Okay. One word that describes you as a person.
As a person, I would say genuine. Yeah.
One advice to my, let's say, 24-year-old self that you would have, assuming I'm starting out my career.
Yeah, I would say think long term and build your skills in the initial years.
Thank you for dealing with that. Thank you, Gaurav. Gaurav Gupta. If you could exchange one responsibility with your spouse, which one would you give and which one would you take?
I would get her to walk the dogs and I would do the cooking.
Okay, one thing that you couldn't do even at gunpoint.
Paint. Sing, actually. Singing would be even worse.
And you are a self-proclaimed expert at blank. Fill up the blank.
I'm a self-proclaimed expert at, I think, oh, geez.
That's a consultant blank.
It's a tough one for a consultant. We pretend to be experts at everything, right?
Exactly.
Actually, I think I'm a self-proclaimed expert at hosting webinars.
Note to self, and Neha, make a note. Next time you have another webinar coming up, you know who to call. What's the first place you will go to once COVID settles?
I would probably go to Japan. I have a need to go every year.
And why?
I adore Japanese food and I actually miss it. So
fair enough. What do you like most about being in a lockdown?
Spending more time with my nearly 4-year-old daughter, and I'm hoping not to change that post the lockdown.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you a similar question to what I asked Gaurav. If you weren't a consultant, what else in your professional life, what else would you have been?
Well, I was an entrepreneur, so I think I would just continue running companies into the ground. Dalberg was just one of the companies that actually succeeded.
Well, thank you, Gaurav. You did well. Thank you for bearing with my volley of questions that I fired at you. Rishi, it's your turn next to be tortured. Okay. So what's the one house chore you feel you've mastered during COVID?
Mopping.
Oh. And what's a new skill you've picked up in these times, not to do with household chores?
Mopping.
Okay.
Mopping well, I should say. My wife is very particular if there's a spot of dust left. So mopping well is what I would say.
Okay. And what's that one, since this kind of ended up being a similar answer, so I'm going to ask you the question again. What skill would you like to pick up in a future sabbatical if you were to take one?
I think I'd like to go back to charcoal sketching. Used to do it a long time ago. So we'd love to go back to it.
That makes two of us. Okay, great. When you're in a boring meeting, what do you do?
I have a poker face and my mind wanders off to think about other things.
I'm not going to ask you what your mind wanders off to. We will spare the audience that. One web series you recently watched that you would recommend?
I don't watch TV at all. I'm more of a reading person. So nothing.
Okay. Any book that you would like to recommend?
Yes. I mean, there is a interesting Northeastern author I read, which was quite interesting for me, Bitter Wormwood. I don't know if any of you have read Eastern Ka. It's quite an interesting account of Northeastern insurgency. So from a very personal, fictional perspective.
If you were to live the life of a character from a movie or a TV series, who will it be?
Who would it be, or who would I like to be? I like to be Simpson, but I don't think I would want to be Simpson. So in terms of, again, TV series is difficult because I don't watch many of them. But yeah, maybe Sherlock Holmes. That'll be nice.
Wow, that's exactly the answer I would have given actually for this question. How funny. That's it for you. Thank you, Rishi. And we move to Seema. The one social media platform that has you hooked.
Social media platform. I'm still old world, Facebook.
Okay. Yeah, you realize you've given your age away by that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, one house chore that you're having to do but you dislike.
Managing Zoom classes for my kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can empathize with that, though mine are grown up. The best professional compliment you have ever received.
I think that I can cut through the crap and get to the point, and I'm not scared of doing that.
That's a good one. You should be proud. One thing you can't do to save your life.
One thing I can't do to save my life. It used to be cooking. It genuinely used to be cooking. Now I think I've mastered that. So what's another? I don't know. I think, no, wait. I genuinely believe that I am not creative. I've tried every creative art possible, but I'm just not good at it. So I would never survive on that.
There's a creativity in everybody. It's just a matter of how you look at it. What's the longest you've ever gone on a virtual meeting without falling asleep?
Without falling asleep. 6 hours. 6 hours. So we moved our global partner meets to online this year.
Yeah.
And they were literally 6 hours at a stretch. And I won't tell you what else I did during that time, but I didn't fall asleep.
And if you were stranded on a deserted island alone, what are the 3 things you will keep with you?
Keep with me. I love scuba diving, so that's a dream. So I would have my diving gear. I would hope to have a diary or something to be able to pen down my thoughts on. Assuming this island doesn't have internet connectivity, so then I guess maybe just music.
And last one, if you had to meet one public figure, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I think I'm tossing it up, and I want to right now, like, given Jacinda Ardern's fame, but I'd still go back to Nehru. I think he was a big part of what this country is and how he conceptualized it, and I have a whole bunch of questions around that. Also, some bones to pick, so maybe that.
Thank you, and you guys are awesome. Thank you so much for putting up with that. Neha, over to you.
Swati, you're not going to escape the rapid fire, okay? Let's toss some questions to you as well. Okay, so Swati, the rapid fire for you then. What is the first thing that you would like to do once the lockdown is over?
I think go and see my family.
Oh, okay, you're staying away? Okay.
As in family in the sense, not my immediate family, but my extended family. Okay. My siblings and my father and yeah. And my
one advice that you would give to your 24-year-old self starting out her career?
Actually very similar to what Goel was saying. I would say invest the time in learning and don't be in a hurry.
Mm-hmm. And what would you do on a deserted island? The 3 things that you will keep for yourself?
I'm assuming that there is connectivity. So I think I would want a cell phone. I would want a solar powered battery, solar battery charger to keep the cell phone going. That's the second thing. And third, I think I would want a lighter so I can, fend for myself for some food to be able to make fire. Yeah.
And what did you miss the most during the lockdown?
I actually don't miss a whole lot. I think what I miss the most is probably just human interaction outside of the family. Just meeting people, meeting extended family and meeting friends. It's kind of like what Arpita was saying.
Great. Thank you so much, Swati. And thanks to all the panelists for, kind of really giving us some very insightful discussion and also having some fun together. But, before we come to the last segment, I just want to kind of share that, you all have had inspiring journeys in this sector, and I'm privileged to know a little bit of the same. But I would love the audience to know a little bit as well, and myself, including myself. So it'll be lovely to know from all of you, actually, including you, Swati, that what made you choose to do what you're doing currently? All of you come from mainstream corporate backgrounds, but have chosen a very interesting and different career path. So, any reflections on your journey? How has it gone? Do you regret anything? How are you feeling about it? I think that is what I would love to, all of you to share with us. And I'll start with Seema, and as we move along.
Yeah. So, in some ways, I've been at the same place for 20 years, literally the first job, right? So I've been at BCG from the day I left campus. But I think the reason why I decided to sort of explore the development space. So back in 2007, I got promoted to a principal at BCG, and then the next step is to become a partner in MDP. And it suddenly struck me, and I just turned 30. So I've given away my age now perfectly, Swati. And it suddenly struck me that if I now stay on the same track of becoming an MDP, and I was doing telecom and financial services, then it's 4 years to becoming a partner MDP, and then you become that to stay that. And I suddenly saw myself being 40 and still continuing to do what I was doing. And I think while I genuinely enjoyed problem solving, I genuinely enjoyed interacting with clients, it somehow didn't feel complete, necessarily. I had an itch to try the development space. I didn't know whether I wanted to be in it or not, like permanently, but I definitely had an itch to try it. And it felt like if I didn't try it then I would miss out on the boat. So I actually went to the head of BCG and said, hey, maybe I took 4 months off firstly, and did the proverbial sort of trip through South America, to find myself and find my inner self and all of that. Came back, went to the head of BCG and said, hey, I think I want to quit. I want to try the development space for a little bit. And then, if it doesn't work, I'll certainly come back. I know I have a home here, but, maybe it will work, but it's just an itch that I have. I need to try it. I think the great thing was that, they gave me the space, BCG gave me the space to try it within the firm. And not only did I try it, but, I really loved it. That itself was a journey very quickly. So 30 seconds, from, starting with, doing completely pro bono work with, with small civil society organizations to working with central government on sort of policy and research to finally sort of coming to, working with, large foundations on their agendas, as well as state governments on large scale transformation. So finding that sweet spot of where you can do sort of the breakthrough thinking, but also then, get it implemented into the ground and see some of that change happen. So that itself has been a journey, which took another 6-7 years. And then, the last 5-6 years I've been feeling fairly settled in where I am. So that's my journey.
That's great, Seema. Thanks for sharing that with us. How about you, Gaurav Gupta? Gaurav.
So Seema and I have a very similar background, right? And similar age, maybe perhaps exactly the same. I think sort of coming to those crossroads at about the same time as well. But I think, the way I think about it is that I fell into management consulting. I didn't know anything. I didn't know what McKinsey or BCG was. In 2000, when I was graduating, I thought I would join the UN. I always wanted to work in social justice issues. And it was because I happened to spend all of my holidays working because I needed to earn some money to pay for college. It was actually, I was advised by my bosses, right? Like I was working at IBM and other places, and my boss at IBM told me, don't go work for the UN. Firstly, no one is ever going to accept you straight out of college. And don't come and work for me, which was a bit of a disappointing thing to hear. He said, go and, apply to BCG or McKinsey. And so that's how I got into my previous career. That wasn't like an ambition as such. And I actually really liked it. And I thought, okay, well, I enjoyed that sort of journey. But ultimately for me, it was always about, there were two things I was attracted to. I was attracted to, I guess, social justice as a cause, and to sort of, what perhaps people sometimes talk about is, what is meaningful for you? So that was meaningful to me, right? And then the other thing I was attracted to was complexity. Like, I always enjoyed problem solving, and the more complex the problem, the more, that's what sort of got me out of bed. And I think that's something I would give advice to everybody who is thinking about careers, is they often think about the meaningfulness. That's fine. Meaning gets you to choose something. It does not keep you there on a day-to-day basis. Your day-to-day has to be something that you really just invigorates you. And you can't constantly be thinking about, it's not true that everyone is sitting there just constantly thinking about how am I helping everyone every day. Practical thing, people leave work if the coffee is bad, right? Practical things matter. And for me, it was always about, am I getting to work with smart people on really exciting things? So that's why that really forced the change, because at some point the corporate sector is optimizing for one variable, which is profit. And any mathematician knows that when you optimize for more than one variable, which is like, what the social sector is, right? Optimizing for girls in school, outcomes on education, and actually money as well, and so forth. You go to 2 variables, 3 variables, and the complexity skyrockets. And that makes, so these problems are interesting. They attract some incredible minds to them. And so to me, it was about meaningful work on one axis. So this is my 2x2, my version of the BCG 2x2, right? Is that, interesting, sort of complex problem statements and really meaningful work, right? And so the top right-hand quadrant of that is kind of what I want to occupy. And that's really been the ambition of sort of building out Dalberg. What's amazing is that, a lot of the clients that we then deal with and the other collaborators that come in are similar, right? They're working, I always say that some of my clients who are running NGOs could easily run any of the top companies. Like, looking at the complexity that they're dealing with and how they do it is just amazing. And so I think that's what got me excited, and that's what keeps me here.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Gaurav. Very insightful. What about you, Rishi?
So you've got
your journey been like
3 consultants lined up in a row, which is probably, we can In consulting, the most used shortcut is Control-C, Control-V. So it could just be that right now. I mean, similar story. So, did consulting for 7 years. Actually, I got bored after doing 3 brand launches and 3 market entry strategies and 2 pricing work. There was a template in your head. You went into a client and you said, I know in week 5, this is what the deck would look like. In week 10, this is what it looked like. Yes, I'll be dealing with different personalities, different sector, but hey, it's not going to be that intellectually challenging. So for me, coming to social sector was, where are the toughest problems that we can work on? Where is it that I will find, as Gaurav was talking about, rather than a single variable algebraic equation, a linear programming optimization thing to sort of look at and say, what is it that the solution would look like? So for me, it was like, let's go and work on something where challenges are difficult, it's going to be meaningful, and you're going to leave an impact rather than, help a tobacco company make 10% better margins or have another $100 million brand.
Yeah, I think purpose has definitely somewhere come into the way. But Gaurav, you taken this mode the earliest, actually, probably our 40 under 40. What made you kind of take that decision in the early 3 years of your career?
Yeah. So again, I know consultants, but yeah, I was working with McKinsey at the time. Everything was going fine. It was a place I was enjoying, a good institution. I was learning a lot. Seemed to be a natural fit. So I was not at all bored with consulting or anything of that sort. Everything was good. But I then always say that just because a highway is good, you cannot continue to drive on it, right? Especially when your destination is something else. And in my case, clearly the destination was impact. Always wanted to do something that's meaningful, that'll have a real impact at scale. Something that I had been consciously thinking since my undergrad days. And everything else that I was doing, be it my MBA, be it my stint at McKinsey, all of that was a preparation for what I wanted to do. So it was a pretty straightforward decision in my case. And then when I quit McKinsey, after that I traveled a lot. I traveled for 6 months within India, in the country. That took me to some 17 different states, 70 different districts. And in that sense, that period of 6 months was my orientation to the impact domain, to the development world. Did a whole series of things in that time, including spending a lot of time with government officials on the ground, and with a lot of organizations that were doing outstanding work in different parts of the country. But that was my orientation, and that's what that process kind of gave birth to Samagra, where the core thesis has always been better governance as a lever to create large-scale impact. We fundamentally believe that a lot of things can be done outside of the system, but you want to touch millions and millions of people and transform their lives. We cannot wish away the political and the governance process, and that's how Samagra was born. And it's been a very, I would say, fulfilling journey over the last 7.5 years, and hope to kind of continue on that in a long time to come.
Yeah, it's truly wonderful. Very inspiring, actually. What about you, Arpita? You're on mute, I think.
Yeah. So for me, I think out of all the people I see in the panel, without knowing their ages, I think it struck me the later one. So 25 years into consulting, having held various global and Indian leadership roles in these organizations, PwC, KPMG, etc. I think it had started dawning on me, and then I would say as I was going to turn 50, it dawned on me that I needed to do something which was more directly impactful and for the less privileged and excluded parts of the population. And I didn't know how to go about it because I was a consultant for 25 years and working with corporates and doing what consultants do. So for the first time in my life, I actually took a break. I quit without a plan, which was very uncharacteristic of me because I was very confused. And Neha, we've had chats about it as well. So I was wanting to do multiple things. I was wanting to do something which was impactful, where I could help bring my skill sets to less privileged people, etc. I also wanted to do board services because I thought I've worked in the corporate sector, and with my experience, I had seen that there could be things that could be done to make them more effective. So there was a couple of things that I wanted to do, work with, tech entrepreneurs, etc. And so so I'm now doing a mix of these things. And the organization I'm heading now, M-CRIL, it works as a double bottom line business. So it is a mission-driven company. ADB is Asian Development Bank is a strategic investor. And the idea is to improve the lives and livelihoods of people in the region, the Asia region, which is what we do. And this company has been doing for the last 30 years. So I think, yeah, so far so good. It fits into what I set out to do. And it also helps me bring some of the best practices of consulting that we see. So I think the other thing that I see is that sometimes the sector could do with some more structured approach in terms of how things are done. Because in the earlier days, sometimes it was seen that if you were working in the impact sector, you were just doing good. So it was all right if you were not particularly very efficient or doing it in a structured manner. So, but I see the change. There's a lot of professionals I am now meeting since in this role who have come from the corporate world, and I think it's for the good, because it's again a double bottom line view of things, of your personal thing, the company that you're working with. Yeah, so it's been good, and I don't miss it. I don't miss my earlier journey. So earlier company, yeah. Neha, you are on mute. Yeah.
But I think, before we close that, I think Swati's also had a similar kind of a journey. She's also transitioned and, come in this space. So I'd like to hear from you, Swati, as well. And I think we are going to a closure phase right now. So, but quickly, let's kind of cover this, and maybe the rest of it, I will still keep writing to you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity for me to share mine as well. I would say the professional transition trigger point happened when I moved to India about 12 years ago, and I wanted to give back to the country where I was born and make a difference. But the seeds were really sown back in college days during IIT when, as a part of this thing called NSS, or National Social Service, we had to do X hours of service. So I chose to teach, and I would teach children of class 4 employees at IIT, and I found it incredibly rewarding and fulfilling. So the bug was really planted within the DNA back then. And I made my foray into not-for-profit through Safe Water Network in 2009 when after moving to the country. But I think I'm a bit of an odd one out here. I didn't necessarily make a permanent shift from the for-profit to the development sector per se. Instead, I kind of have done a bit of back and forth a few times now. And I've really enjoyed keeping a foot on both sides because I feel there are things to learn from either side which can be applied on the other.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been my journey. And I've enjoyed both. So I haven't really made a transition. I do both. Maybe that's what I'm trying to do. And it is possible to do both. So I'm a live example.
No, absolutely. I think thanks so much, Swati, for sharing, your thoughts and also your journey, and also moderating the session today. So I think it was really a very, very insightful, and big thank you to all the panelists for making it a very rich session.